Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where the darkest shadows of history are brought back to light. Tonight, we uncover a day that ripped America apart. A day when fear thundered through the heart of Oklahoma City. It wasn't a foreign enemy. It wasn't a war overseas. This was terror born at home, unleashed in broad daylight against innocent men, women, and children. The blast was so powerful it shook buildings for miles, but the shock it left behind would haunt a nation forever. This is the story of the Oklahoma City bombing, America's deadliest domestic terror attack. Asterisk. It was April 19, 1995, and the morning began like any other in downtown Oklahoma City. The sun had just climbed above the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. Parents hurried through traffic, clutching their children's small hands as they dropped them off at the daycare center inside the building. Workers carried briefcases, chatted casually with colleagues, and walked into the glass doors ready for another day of paperwork, phone calls, and ordinary tasks. Street vendors set up nearby, pedestrians strolled past, and no one suspected that. Within minutes, their lives would be forever altered. The hum of the city was steady, filled with honking horns, ringing phones, and footsteps echoing across the sidewalks. For many, it was just another Wednesday, nothing extraordinary, nothing to mark it apart. Yet in the heart of that bustling city, a storm of destruction had already been set in motion, unseen and unsuspected by the hundreds of men, women, children inside that building. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the illusion of peace shattered in the blink of an eye. A thunderous explosion ripped through the core of Oklahoma City, a blast so violent that it could be felt miles away. The ground trembled as if struck by an earthquake. Windows shattered in every direction, cars were tossed like toys, and within seconds, the 9-story Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was reduced to a mangled skeleton of twisted steel and crumbling concrete. Dust clouds swallowed the streets, smoke rose into the morning sky, and a silence of shock was broken by piercing screams, cries for help, and the desperate voices of survivors trapped beneath rubble. Those who had been inside were thrown against walls, pinned under desks, or buried alive in the chaos. The deafening roar of the blast still echoed in their ears as confusion and terror spread through the city like wildfire. People in surrounding buildings stumbled out into the streets, dazed and bleeding, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dust. Sirens began to wail as emergency services rushed toward the disaster. Office workers looked out from shattered windows in disbelief, some clutching their mouths as they witnessed the horror unfolding across the street. The blast was so powerful, it damaged more than 300 buildings in the downtown area, leaving wide radius of destruction. But the epicenter, the Murrah Building, was unrecognizable. Whole floors had collapsed onto one another, the daycare center reduced to rubble, and hundreds of federal employees trapped inside what only moments ago had been their workplace. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of burning, and the choking dust of broken concrete. Survivors crawled through debris, searching for light. Children cried for their parents, and those who had escaped unharmed ran back toward the ruins in desperate attempts to rescue loved ones. The chaos was unlike anything Oklahoma City had ever seen. Emergency workers, firefighters, and police officers sprinted to the scene, their radios filled with panicked voices reporting mass casualties. They clawed through rubble with bare hands at first, pulling out survivors and carrying them to safety. People from nearby buildings rushed in without hesitation, forming human chains to remove debris, ignoring the danger of collapsing walls that could fall at any moment. Parents screamed for their children, their voices lost in the roar of sirens, while strangers held each other and prayed. In the midst of the destruction lay silence in places, a haunting stillness that suggested the lives already lost beneath the wreckage. News crews began arriving within minutes, broadcasting the unimaginable devastation to the entire nation. Images of bloodied survivors covered in dust and soot spread across television screens, showing the country that something unthinkable had occurred not in a war zone, but in the heart of America. It did not take long for the gravity of the event to sink in. This was no accident. The sheer magnitude of the explosion, the placement of the destruction, the deliberate targeting of a federal building, everything pointed to one horrifying conclusion. This was an act of terror. Yet in those first chaotic hours, no one knew who could be behind such an attack, or why they had chosen Oklahoma City as the stage for such brutality. The rescue workers continued to dig, calling out into the rubble, listening for faint cries or tapping sounds that might mean someone was still alive beneath the layers of crushed concrete. Small children were pulled out, their faces covered in blood and dust, many too shocked to cry. Some were handed to firefighters who carried them with urgency, weaving through crowds of panicked parents who searched desperately for any sign of their loved ones. Survivors stumbled out with broken bones and burns, guided by rescuers through jagged ruins that still threatened to collapse further. The streets were lined with ambulances, doctors, and nurses rushing from hospital to hospital, overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties arriving at once. People across the nation stared in disbelief as the images came in, struggling to comprehend that such devastation had been carried out not by nature or an accident, but by human hands. In Washington, D.C., the government declared a state of emergency, and President Bill Clinton promised swift justice once the perpetrators were found. But in Oklahoma City itself, there was no time to think about vengeance. The priority was survival, saving as many lives as possible, and pulling the living from the ruins before it was too late. Every passing second mattered, and every cry for help reminded rescuers that someone was still trapped beneath the mountain of destruction. And as the dust continued to rise above the city, survivors stood in shock, unable to process what had happened, unable to understand why their ordinary morning had transformed into a nightmare that would scar the heart of America forever. Rescue teams surged into downtown Oklahoma City within minutes of the explosion, but nothing could prepare them for the sight that awaited. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building stood like a torn carcass, its facade ripped open to reveal the broken skeleton of offices, staircases dangling into empty air, and crushed floors that had pancaked onto one another. The streets were covered in shattered glass, overturned cars, and debris so sharp and heavy that moving through it was a danger of its own. Firefighters and paramedics wove through the chaos, their boots crunching against rubble as they searched desperately for survivors. The wails of sirens filled the air, mingling with the anguished cries of families and the moans of those trapped beneath fallen concrete. It was no longer a building, it was a graveyard in the making, and every second counted. Among the destruction, a scene emerged that would sear itself into the memory of America. The daycare center inside the building, once filled with the laughter and chatter of children, was gone. Tiny chairs were crushed under slabs of concrete, toys lay broken and covered in dust, and rescue workers pulled out small bodies as horrified parents screamed their children's names. Some children survived, pulled out alive but bloodied and terrified, while others lay still in the arms of firefighters, their lives ended before they had even begun. Out of the 168 lives claimed that day, 19 of them were children, and their loss became the most painful reminder of the cruelty behind the blast. News cameras captured images of rescuers carrying toddlers with bloodied faces and lifeless limbs, images that stunned the entire nation into silence. As emergency crews continued their frantic work, the FBI and local investigators began to descend on the scene. This was no natural disaster, no gas leak, no accident. The magnitude of the destruction pointed to one undeniable truth. It was a bomb, and a massive one. Investigators combed through the wreckage, searching for anything that could reveal how it had been built. Amid the chaos, they found twisted fragments of a vehicle axle, and other pieces of metal that seemed out of place. Hours later, forensic teams determined it had come from a rented Ryder truck. That discovery sent a chilling wave through the team. Someone had deliberately parked a truck loaded with thousands of pounds of explosives directly in front of the federal building and walked away. The question now was who would commit such a monstrous act. Initial speculation swirled. In those early hours, many believed foreign terrorists might have struck, echoing the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. Law enforcement braced for the possibility of an international connection, and fear rippled across the country that a larger wave of attacks could be unfolding. But even as speculation ran wild, a small break in the case was already in motion, though no one yet realized its importance. Just 90 minutes after the blast, a young man was pulled over by an Oklahoma state trooper for driving without a license plate. His name was Timothy McVeigh, a Gulf War veteran, and he carried with him a concealed firearm. At the time, his arrest seemed like routine police work, nothing to tie him to the horror unfolding in Oklahoma City. He was taken into custody for the weapons charge, but what the authorities didn't know yet was that McVeigh was the very man who had detonated the bomb. The timing of his arrest would soon prove to be one of the most crucial turning points in the investigation. Meanwhile, back at the scene, the rescue effort became a race against time. Volunteers poured in from across the city, some trained, others just ordinary people desperate to help. They formed bucket brigades, passing rubble by hand, listening intently for muffled cries beneath the debris. Dogs trained in search and rescue were brought in, barking frantically when they caught the scent of life. Every discovery of a survivor was met with cheers and tears, while every recovery of a lifeless body deepened the grief that seemed to weigh on the entire city. Hospitals were overwhelmed, doctors and nurses working without rest, treating burns, broken bones, and trauma injuries as quickly as possible. Television crews broadcasted live, their footage carrying the destruction into homes across America. Viewers saw firefighters with sweat-soaked uniforms, paramedics cradling crying children, and the smoldering wreckage of a federal building that had once been a pillar of civic life. The nation was glued to their screens, struggling to comprehend the enormity of the tragedy. For many, it seemed impossible that such destruction could happen in the middle of the United States, far from foreign enemies or battlefields. But the truth was beginning to emerge, and it was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The investigation moved quickly. With the discovery of the Ryder truck parts, agents traced the vehicle back to a rental shop in Junction City, Kansas. The rental agreement was signed under the name Robert Kling, but a description of the man who had rented the truck began to match up with the very man sitting in custody on unrelated charges. It was Timothy McVeigh, and suddenly, the pieces began to align. This was not the work of a foreign group. It was orchestrated by one of America's own citizens. As the evidence piled up, the nation's shock deepened. The possibility that the deadliest act of domestic terror in American history had been carried out by an American soldier turned against his own country was almost too horrifying to accept. But for the survivors, acceptance had no place in their reality. They lived moment to moment, clinging to the hope that someone still buried could be brought out alive. Candlelight vigils began forming outside the ruins, with families holding photographs of their missing loved ones, praying for miracles. In the midst of devastation, flowers and teddy bears appeared on the sidewalks as strangers mourned for children they had never known. The city itself became a living memorial, its people bound together by grief and resilience. And while the nation's eyes focused on the fight on manhunt and investigation for those in Oklahoma City, the immediate question remained how to survive one of the darkest days in American history. Timothy McVeigh was not an ordinary criminal who stumbled into violence. He was a man who had carefully and coldly built a belief system that would one day erupt into an act of terror. Born in 1968 in upstate New York, he grew up fascinated with guns, survivalist culture, and a deep distrust of government authority. After serving in the Gulf War, where he proved himself as a capable soldier, McVeigh returned home disillusioned, restless, and increasingly radicalized. He carried with him anger, not just at what he saw as failures of his government, but at the government itself. What began as frustration soon twisted into hatred, and by the early 1990s, McVeigh had immersed himself in far-right militias, survivalist manuals, and conspiracies about government tyranny. His rage crystallized during the 1993 siege at Waco, Texas, where a standoff between federal agents and the Branch Davidians ended in fire and death. To McVeigh, this was not the failure of a cult leader, but the ultimate symbol of government brutality. He drove to Waco to witness the aftermath and sold bumper stickers with anti-government slogans at gun shows. Every new event that painted the government as powerful or overreaching only deepened his fury. He believed war had already been declared against citizens like him, and that it was his duty to strike back. In his mind, he was no longer a soldier who had fought for his country. He was a soldier preparing to fight against it. McVeigh was not alone in his thinking. He grew close to Terry Nichols, a fellow Army buddy who shared many of his views, and Michael Fortier, a drifter with whom he discussed his plans. Together, they began piecing together the idea of a massive strike that would not just kill but send a message of fear. McVeigh's choice of target was deliberate: the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. To him, it was not just a structure of glass and concrete, but a symbol of federal power, filled with agencies like the ATF, which he despised. He scouted the building, studied its structure, and noted its daycare center without compassion, seeing the presence of children not as a deterrent but as a consequence of his war. The planning was meticulous. McVeigh and Nichols began stockpiling materials, gathering tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, and mixing it with fuel oil to create an explosive compound. They rented storage units, hid their purchases, and tested small bombs in the countryside to ensure their design would work. Each detail was calculated, from the quantity of chemicals to the timing of the detonation. They used stolen explosives, manuals, military knowledge, and months of preparation to create a weapon capable of leveling a building. Nichols helped acquire supplies and store them, though his role remained more in support, while McVeigh carried the vision of the attack forward with ruthless determination. By April 1995, everything was in place. McVeigh rented a Ryder truck under a false name, using forged identification to hide his trail. He and Nichols loaded the vehicle with a massive homemade bomb, layer by layer, until it was a weapon of unprecedented domestic destruction. On April 18th, the day before the attack, McVeigh drove the truck into Oklahoma City, staying overnight at a motel while his plan weighed heavily in the air. He had written an anti-government manifesto, filled with references to Waco, the Constitution, and his belief that violence was the only answer. To him, the bombing would be his declaration of war, a single act meant to awaken others who shared his ideology. The morning of April 19th was quiet as McVeigh steered the Ryder truck into downtown Oklahoma City. The streets bustled with workers heading into offices, parents dropping children at the daycare, and traffic weaving through intersections. McVeigh parked directly in front of the Murrah Building, his vehicle carrying more than 4,800 pounds of explosives. He lit the fuse, set the timer, and calmly walked away, blending into the crowd. Witnesses later recalled seeing a man in military-style clothing leaving the truck, though no one had any reason to suspect what was about to happen. As he disappeared into the city, the countdown ticked toward the moment that would alter history. At 9:02 a.m., the truck detonated with a force so powerful it registered as a seismic event. McVeigh did not look back, but he knew exactly what he had unleashed. The sight of a 9-story building collapsing into dust, of people running through streets covered in blood and debris, of children's cries buried under concrete. These were all outcomes he had anticipated and accepted as necessary. To him, it was not murder but a strike against tyranny, an act of war carried out on behalf of a cause he believed justified any level of destruction. Investigators quickly pieced together that this was no foreign plot but a homegrown one. The truck axle discovered in the rubble provided the crucial breakthrough, leading them to the rental shop in Kansas and eventually to McVeigh himself. As they traced receipts, eyewitness accounts, and false IDs, the profile became clear. This was not an outsider but a decorated veteran who had turned his back on his oath and declared war on the very nation he once swore to protect. Nichols and Fortier's roles also began to unravel, revealing a small but dangerous network of conspirators who had helped make the bombing possible. For America, the realization was chilling. The deadliest terror attack in its history had not come from foreign soil but from within, carried out by men who lived among them, shopped at their stores, and once wore their uniform. It was a betrayal that cut deep into the nation's sense of safety, forcing people to question how far hate could grow when fueled by ideology and anger. And as the investigation closed in on McVeigh, the next question loomed larger than any other: what justice would look like for the hundreds of lives destroyed in a single morning. The trial of Timothy McVeigh began under the weight of a nation's grief, its eyes fixed on the man who had carried out the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history. Survivors filled the courtroom, many of them scarred physically and emotionally, forced to relive the morning when their lives had been torn apart. Families of the dead sat silently, clutching photographs of loved ones who would never return, staring at McVeigh with a mix of rage and sorrow. Prosecutors laid out the case with brutal clarity: the receipts for fertilizer, the Ryder truck rental traced to him, the eyewitness accounts, and the testimony of his accomplices. Piece by piece, they painted the picture of a man who had plotted with chilling patience, who had driven his weapon of destruction into the heart of a city and walked away without hesitation. McVeigh himself remained cold and detached throughout the trial. He showed little emotion as the prosecution described the devastation he had caused, the lives he had ended, the children who had been pulled lifeless from the rubble. At times, he even appeared smug, convinced that his act had meaning beyond the courtroom, that history would view him not as a murderer, but as a soldier in a war against government tyranny. He admitted his role without remorse, speaking openly about his hatred for the government and citing Waco and Ruby Ridge as his justification. To him, the men, women, and children who had died were casualties of war, sacrifices he believed necessary to awaken others to his cause. His words were met with silence from the courtroom, a silence heavy with disbelief that someone could cloak such cruelty in the language of ideology. For the jury, the decision was inevitable. In 1997, Timothy McVeigh was convicted on 11 federal counts, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of first-degree murder for the federal agents who died in the blast. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. During the sentencing phase, survivors took the stand to describe the horror of that day. Parents spoke of the children they had lost. Firefighters described pulling lifeless bodies from rubble, and workers who had escaped told of the screams of colleagues trapped behind them. Their voices broke as they recounted the moment there. Lives changed forever, and the weight of their testimony left the courtroom drowning in grief. The jury sentenced McVeigh to death, a sentence many believed was the only measure of justice left to offer. As McVeigh sat on death row, the country wrestled with the aftermath of the bombing. The site of the Murrah Federal Building was transformed into a memorial with 168 empty chairs representing each life lost. Survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, haunted by memories of dust-filled air, broken bodies, and silence that followed the blast. The tragedy brought out the resilience of Oklahoma City, which became known as the Oklahoma Standard, a phrase symbolizing the compassion, unity, and strength its people showed in the face of devastation. Strangers had run into burning rubble to save others. Families had opened their homes to the displaced, and the entire community had stood together when everything around them seemed to fall apart. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at a federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, becoming the first federal prisoner executed in nearly 4 decades. Hundreds of survivors and family members of victims were given the chance to watch the execution, some in person, others through closed-circuit television. For many, it was a moment of closure, though not healing. McVeigh remained unrepentant to the end, offering no apology, no words of regret, and no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. His final statement was a poem he had chosen, defiant and unyielding, leaving behind the same coldness he carried throughout his trial. The Oklahoma City bombing left scars that never fully healed, not only on the families who lost loved ones, but on the nation as a whole. It was a reminder that terror does not always come from outside its borders, that hate can grow quietly within, fueled by anger and ideology until it erupts into violence. It forced America to reckon with the danger of extremism from its own citizens, and the fragility of the peace people take for granted in everyday life. Yet it also revealed the strength of unity, as Oklahoma City rose from the ashes not with hate but with resilience and compassion. Today, the empty chairs at the memorial stand as silent witnesses to that April morning, each one representing a story cut short, a life ended in the blink of an eye. The bombing remains etched in history as a tragedy born not of foreign enemies, but of homegrown hate. It is a chilling reminder of how one man's fury can destroy countless lives, but also how a community can stand together in the aftermath of unspeakable loss. And as the echoes of that blast continue to haunt memory, America carries with it the lesson that the greatest threats can sometimes come from within, and the only way forward is through unity, vigilance, and the refusal to let hate define the future.